The Second Coming for Ireland in Revolution. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. The Second Coming is an extraordinary poem that registers or consolidates Yeats's reputation as the greatest poet of the 20th century in many people's view. At the same time, as we can see, it's an extraordinarily obscure poem, or rather, the poem, even as we might claim to understand it, has behind it a vast architecture of mythology, a vast mythologization of history that Yeats was cultivating in his relationship to magic, visionary practice, and increasingly his partner, George Yeats's automatic writing. Yeats got married to George in 1917, and while they were on their honeymoon, she began automatic writing. Yeats was fascinated and began to use his wife as a medium to speak to the spirit world. And it was from the spirit world that he began to get the outlay or the outline of what would become known in a book published in 1925, A Vision. And this vision was Yeats's response, his replacement of, his displacement of history by a personal theory of the historical process, as intricate in its details, though perhaps not as intellectually coherent as Hegel, with the master-slave dialectic. And the poem, The Second Coming, is Yeats articulating his vision of the historical process from his perspective in 1919. Between 1916 and 1923, Ireland was in revolution for real. After the 1916 Rising, there comes the War of Independence, following on the 1918 election. The 1918 election is a key moment in Republican discourse in Ireland because a majority of seats in a democratic election hosted by the English authorities was won by Sinn Féin in Ireland, meaning that Home Rule had been democratically approved by the majority of Irish people. But the English authorities, in order to appease the Protestant Unionist communities of the North, set aside the results of the 1918 election and began to intrigue. They began, in other words, to plan what would become the birth of a Protestant state for a Protestant people known as Northern Ireland. A boundary commission would be formulated in 1925 to draw the boundary, and Ireland would be partitioned. British colonialism is notorious around the world for invasion, occupation, poisoning the local soil by a divide and conquer rule that used ethnic politics and identities to divide subject populations amongst themselves. And then they would withdraw disastrously from colonial occupation and partition the lands in ways that ratified and deepened and consolidated and reified the ethnic divisions. The history then of British colonialism and partition in occupied Palestine, in Ireland, and on the Indian subcontinent, just to take three examples, is a particularly vicious cycle of ethnic hatred, set in train by the politics of expediency. And in Ireland, as we can see, the birth of Northern Ireland as an ethnic state, as the outcome of an Irish War of Independence followed by an Irish Civil War, was the kind of poison at the root of the tree of liberty, if you want to use a kind of fanciful metaphor. Yeats is living through this entire process, and it's not just, of course, Ireland that's in revolution, because we're just having witnessed in World War I the first instance of the use of all of the technological innovations of bourgeois capitalism to produce megadeath during World War I. It had never been quite the case that man had been able to slaughter himself in such vast numbers as an index of what was hitherto assumed to have been progress. And there's a sense in which World War I represents the first intimation that the entire rational basis for history since the Enlightenment of the 16th, 17th century and in the 18th century, philosophical history after Descartes, after Francis Bacon, when humanism determined that man was a rational animal and that human history was a rational process of evolution, a progressive realization of the rational aspect of human conduct, and a progressive taming of the baser instincts of our animality. This whole theory of, this whole telos of history as progress dies somewhere between the Battle of the Somme and Auschwitz. And Yeats is living through this great spasm, this great disintegration of sense. Who could look at World War I? Who could look at African colonialism? And who could look at the rise of fascism in Europe and suggest that humans were mostly rational creatures rather than base, instinctually driven animals? So there's a sense in which the vast architecture of Yeats's vision is an attempt to hold on to some sense of order, an alternate pattern of conduct of history, one that can replace the telos of progress, evolution, and enlightenment with something more cyclical, and in Yeats's case, an almost entirely private and hermetically sealed vision. The second coming is the poet of a magician, a wizard, a seer. It's a poem which summons into sight the very things it claims to see. It's Yeats making manifest his own reality, and in doing so, displacing reality as he found it. We know that Yeats was intimately interested in Irish history, but increasingly frustrated by its course. The Irish, specifically the native Irish Catholic population, a population that had now become more Catholic than ever after the 1870s and the Land War and what was called the Devotional Revolution. That Irishness, nativity or indigeneity and Catholicism had begun to seem coterminous or identical or coincidental. To be truly Irish then was now to be an Irish landowning peasant or lower middle class Catholic. And all of the early intoxication of Protestant republicanism in Wolfe Tone and all of the people that Yeats had celebrated in his early poetry and works now seem to be as remote from possibility as it has ever been. And Yeats responded, as we have seen in poems like On a Political Prisoner, to his displacement as a kind of spokesperson for the Irish nation. He responded by cultivating affiliations with Protestant ascendancy, with the settler colonial class. A key poem, as we've seen, a turning point, is Upon a House Shaken by the Land Agitation. 7 years after the Windham Act, and about 5 to 10 years after the Irish Land War had been resolved through litigation and legislation in favour of the Irish landowner, by which I mean the new Irish landowner of the Irish peasant, Yeats began to cultivate a sense of the tragedy of the displacement of this colonial settler class. Ireland was a colony, and it had been governed for centuries by a settler colonial class called the Protestant Ascendancy, and Yeats lived through their collapse and decline. In other words, he lived through Protestant descendancy. And much of his work from this middle period until the end of his life and the play of Purgatory is Yeats's counterfactual response to the eclipse of ascendancy by Catholic nationalism and a kind of abortive Irish republic. The Irish Free State was born of partition in the 1920s, and it wouldn't be until 1937 that Eamon de Valera gave Ireland its first truly Irish, as he saw it, and devoutly Catholic, as he designed it, constitution. And in 1937, Yeats published a second draft of his book, A Vision. So there's a sense in which you can put two documents side by side, Yeats's mythological, magical vision and the processes of constitutional self-definition of the Irish nation against the Protestant ascendancy. So the image you can see on your screen of the historical cones comes from the Vision, and it explains something of the opening image of the Second Coming. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Yeats had a theory of history as proceeding and he situated, I'll see if I can get you a picture of the fluctuation. Here is another example of the image of how Yeats envisaged history. It's two cones, antithetical cones as he calls them. And the idea is that Yeats transposes the cycles of astrology. Think of the phases of the moon as being in a circle. And Yeats takes this notion of the world historical process and recasts it as a kind of process whereby a defining event, an annunciation, and in this case of the Second Coming, it's the birth of Christ, sets up a phase of civilization. And from that moment of civilization, a world historical process of turning outwards begins. And at around this moment, you can see that there's a crisis of disintegration where one cycle ends, and this is where the falcon cannot hear the falconer, meaning in one sense, you know that Yeats uses images of birds of prey like the hawk, as we've seen in On By a Strand, to describe fitness, genetic purity, and inheritance. But it's also a sense of world order, that the bird and the falconer, to the extent that they are in harmony, are a symbol of the harmonies of the world process. And that what Yeats is suggesting is that human history is not what we had believed it to be on the Enlightenment model, a sort of straight line towards progress. It is rather a kind of a cycling out of disintegration into crisis, followed by a new defining event, which then produced the antithetical world process, going backwards and spinning out to a new crisis, where another defining event would then begin the cycle all over again. So it's a kind of dialectic. He suggests in A Vision that he had never read Hegel, but that he got it from people like William Blake. Without contraries is no progression. So the idea, and if you can read A Vision, and I've given you a number of notes here on Brightspace, annotations to the poem, but also this long description of Yeats's own annotation of his sense of what's going on in history. It's a rage for order in the sense that Yeats is trying to recover from the battlefields of the Somme and from the rising in Ireland and from the Civil War, an alternate pattern of history that can recover some kind of sense in the madness. He talks about fundamental mathematical movement. And you can see how this is about the consolations of philosophy, of vision, of magic, against the kind of disaster of history as he saw it. This figure of the soul, as he calls it, is in the body. This antithetical cone diagram is not just an indication or an index, a mapping out indeed, of the movements of the individual body-soul antithesis. Yeats doubles down and says that the figure is also true of history. For the end of an age, which always receives the revelation of the character of the next age, is represented by the coming of one gyre to its place of greatest expansion of the other, to that of its greatest contraction. So we're around here, and this is the moment when the second coming depicts. And Yeats places himself at the point of revelation. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. This is again the extraordinary conduct of an exemplary artist. Yeats, when history ceases to suit him as a historical process, simply envisages an alternative that is generated from his own capacity or propensity for vision. He believed now, through the automatic writing and the seances and the magic which he had been cultivating for years, that he was in touch with the other side, with the Spiritus Mundi. And Spiritus Mundi here means something along the lines of what Jung would call the collective unconscious, that sense in which everything that had ever been thought was available if you could only tap into it as a body of knowledge. So Jung and Yeats are expressing here a conviction that there is an unknown or veiled reality behind the reality that we see. And this is an instinct as ancient as vision itself. But both Jung and Yeats share the conviction that they were actually able to see it. In fact, if you read those lines again, surely, surely, then he repeats the second coming. And it's almost as if his own speech act, hardly are those words out when a vast image troubles my sight. So it's not just that something is being revealed to Yeats in this poem, revelation on his own terms. What else can we say about the poem? He's clear in this poem that the age of Christianity is coming to an end, that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. This is an extraordinary week of Mary and Joseph in the flight from Egypt with the donkey, and the child's birth in Bethlehem, and the birth of Christianity, and the beginning of this cycle from Bethlehem outwards to something like 1919 and World War I and the Irish Revolution and the Russian Revolution and the megadeath of modernity. So many aspects of the Victorian theory of inevitable progress, which was mapped onto, of course, in the English imperial mindset, the inevitable domination of the world by British civilized values. But what that model could not contain, and what Freud would discover and articulate in the unconscious, was its own dark side, the dark side of humanism. In other words, humanism defined humanness by repressing animality, but animality returned with a vengeance in the wars, the colonial wars, and the European wars of this period. And at that point, the entire conviction that there was a world order, that darkness would be dispelled by light, meaning rational conduct, thought, the Enlightenment project of science versus, shall we say, the mysticism of religion. That whole model collapses, and Yeats's vision is an attempt to replace it with something else. We can also link this poem, The Second Coming, to Yeats's growing preoccupation with the conduct of Protestant women and birth. You remember from On a Political Prisoner that Yeats complains of Constance Markiewicz's involvement in the Irish 1916 rising, even though in his earlier work he had suggested that Irish people needed to die for Ireland. What he didn't want, it turns out, was Irish Protestant women getting all involved in Irish politics when they ought to be cultivating their status as ascendancy women. And in On a Political Prisoner, it's as if Constance Markievicz, sitting in prison, deprived of the distractions and preoccupations of politics, returns to her better nature. And at that moment in that poem, a bird circles down from the sky and lands on her hand and eats from her fingers. So there's a sense in which the opposite image begins the poem here, the idea of the bird circling further and further outwards from the falconer until that link between the human and the animal, which is a kind of miniature of the collapse of the historical process as order itself. That link is broken, that all of a sudden, all of the links between the animal and its trainer are ruptured, destroyed, and things fall apart. The center cannot hold. And at this point, he says, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The great thing about this poem, its extraordinary power, is that it condenses a kind of diagnosis of the political age whilst being available for interpretation by almost any given viewpoint in the politics. Let's take the example, for example, of the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. The genius of that line is that everyone speaking that line will believe they know who the best is, and they will also believe that they know who the worst is. For the capitalist, the best is the capitalist, the worst is the socialist. For the British soldier, the best is Britain, the worst is Germany, later Hitler. So that these lines retain their power by purporting to sound deeply prescient about the present, but they're actually willfully obscure in how they allocate blame. But one thing is for sure, there is a best and there is a worst. And in the Irish context, there's no question that for Yeats, the best is increasingly the Protestant ascendancy, which, as we remember from On a House Shaken by Land Agitation, they are the best bred to the best. So that the Irish Catholics then are the worst. So that the worst possible thing has happened in Ireland. The better classes have been subverted by the worst, the uncouth, the Paugines and the Biddies, who wouldn't even accept the gift of Hugh Lane's paintings because they were too tight to pay for a museum to house them, and so forth. Yeats is in an argument with Ireland here. And I'm just going to show you or return to something that we've looked at before. Or at least I'm going to try to. The question being now, is that actually sharing what I hope it is? Yes, okay. In any case, we have here one of these familiar cartoons from the Land War in Ireland, when the English magazine Punch kept publishing cartoons which showed Ireland as a woman that was in danger of being sexually assaulted, raped, and destroyed by Ireland's own masculinity, its own animality, its own barbarism. And what stood between the Irish as passive, helpless female and the Irish as also equally helpless Irish barbarian male was the English law, the sword and the word of this androgynous figure. But if you look at the hat on this bog-trotting Irishman, and this is Irish racism of the 19th century, these are the kinds of stereotypes that the Irish would overcome in their process of becoming white in the 19th and later into the 20th century. Though, of course, in Brexit Britain now, you will hear a lot of talk about the Irish in these terms again. The Irish pass as white when it's deemed suitable to the arbiters of whiteness, and that status can be retracted at any time. Whiteness is a movable feast, in other words, and the Irish were not in the 19th century considered white. But the word we're interested in here is on the hat. Matthew Arnold's racial typologies of Anglo-Saxon and Celt, or what he called culture and anarchy, the best and the worst. And here is anarchy, embodied as an Irish peasant asserting his rights to land. It's Caliban from Shakespeare's Tempest. And this is an aspect in the Second Coming of the mere anarchy that is loosed upon the world. And this is something we're going to see a lot in our reading of Yeats from this period on, that he is refracting a sense of world history, an increasingly idiosyncratic and self-serving account of world history through the lens of Ireland and Irish politics. And one of the reasons why he's so preoccupied with the politics of sexual reproduction and the conduct of Irish women is that, quite simply put, if you look at this grid of the Protestant population in Ireland in what was going to become the Republic of Ireland, you'll notice how the asterisk says that before this period, we're looking at the 26 counties that would become the Republic of Ireland after the partition of Ireland. But you'll see what's happened here to the Protestant population. This is around the period after the Land War. Here is the fall of Parnell, which for Yeats was the defining event of Irish history. An Irish Protestant man had unified the Irish under an extremely effective political process of agitation, the threat of violence contained, and constitutional. The Irish, or the Parnellite party in Westminster, had used what was called unparliamentary parliamentarianism, the filibuster, long speeches. But Parnell had also invented the boycott. And for a long time under Parnell, the Irish Home Rule movement seemed unstoppable. But then a scandal broke because he was having an illicit affair with Kitty O'Shea, and then he was destroyed, as Yeats and Joyce both agreed, by the Catholic Irish prudishness that saw adultery as a sin against God, and the Irish political movement was sacrificed to the mores of sexual politics. But Yeats himself, as we can see, is becoming increasingly interested himself in sexual politics. And the poem, The Second Coming, is a poem about birth and rebirth. Instead of Christ, it's some rough beast. And the rough beast is the notion of what form is the next cycle of history going to take. And Yeats is increasingly preoccupied then with the birth of forms and the forms of birth, by which we mean what is being given born to, or being born. And he's refracting this increasingly through sectarianism. In other words, the form that birth should take for a Protestant woman is a Protestant baby with a Protestant man that is taught Protestant values. And we'll see this when we go on to talk about our next poem, the next poem that Yeats wrote after Second Coming, which is A Prayer for My Daughter. And we'll see in that poem that poem is precisely about Yeats's prayer for his daughter, which is in fact the prayer that she becomes a vehicle for the sexual and social reproduction of Protestant ascendancy in Ireland. Now, the point of all of this is, like Yeats's land politics in Upon a House Shaken by Land Agitation, Yeats is coming to these politics after they can have any meaningful impact on reality. If we go to 1919, the time that these poems are being written, after the 1918 election, but before the War of Independence breaks out, on the point of the breakout of the war, you'll see that the Irish Protestant population goes off a cliff and never comes back. And it's right around here that he starts praying for his daughter to be a vessel for the reproduction of the ascendancy. So this allows us to go back to the vision and to see that a huge part of the point of this vision is that it's meant to displace reality. Yeats is preoccupying himself. He's summoning into sight the vast images out of Spiritus Mundi, because he wants to pitch the contents of the Spiritus Mundi against the actual contents of the Irish political body and constitution and society. The Irish at this time were displaying some of the highest levels of fertility in the world, and this was exacerbated or consolidated by Catholic teachings on contraception as illegal. And contraception was to be banned in Ireland, like abortion. And one of the things that Yeats becomes increasingly preoccupied, along with his preoccupation with Protestant women and their bodies, is Catholic sexual politics around contraception and censorship and oppression. In Brightspace, I've given you the annotations to the poem, The Second Coming. And they will help you to read the poem against the background of Yeats's notes and annotations and commentaries. And I've also given you the first 5 pages or so of the chapter on the Great Wheel, which Yeats considered the principal symbol of his work. And this is the great cycle of history. And that will allow you to put the notions of this gyrating cones and the world historical process of concord and discord, agreement and disagreement, master-slave, integration, disintegration, soul, body. At the end of the day, Yeats's vision is of antitheticals. He's fond of quoting Heraclitus to the point that at a certain point in the historical or world historical process, each thing is dying each other's life and living each other's death. Now, Max Nordau, who we've been studying as the chief diagnostician of degeneration, would label all of this stuff that Yeats was doing, the automatic writing, the magic, the visions, the Spiritus Mundi, as mysticism. And one of the tensions that we're going to see as we come to the end of this course is that all of his life, Yeats has been profoundly convinced of the degeneration hypothesis. Degeneration theory was one of the ways in which people responded to the disintegration or collapse of the Enlightenment project. The Enlightenment project was meant to see history progress like the evolution of species from ape to man. That progress was irresistible, inevitable, and built into the world historical process. Progress was process, and that's what history meant. But when that began to seem untrue, the Boer War being a key moment, the British armies of the empire getting their butts kicked by a small group of Boers somewhere on the butt end of South Africa, all of a sudden there was this growing conviction that the British army were unfit to the purposes of imperialism. And this brought about a growing conviction that in fact society was declining, that progress was not inevitable, and that there was some drag on progress. And this was the degenerate, the unfit. And this disastrous theory of decline was then linked after Darwin to the notions of evolution and projected onto society, social biology, social Darwinism. Now all of a sudden eugenics seemed to explain why degeneration was happening. It's because unfit people, like Irish Catholics, were having lots and lots and lots of babies, the worst, whilst the fit people, the best, including people like Irish Protestant women, weren't having enough babies. And Yeats became profoundly convinced of this diagnosis, that a kind of dysgenic birth differential was operating in Ireland to eclipse the best. And this was not the best for Ireland. At the same time, as we have seen, Yeats's art, his mysticism, his Celticism, his symbolism, all of that would have been held by Nordau to be a symptom of Yeats's degeneration. So Yeats is kind of split here. At the level of politician and historian and mythologist, he's profoundly convinced of degeneration. But as an artist, at the level of form, the form that his art is taking, he seems a bit degenerate himself. And that's one of the reasons why he develops what he called a new manly or muscular form. That's why he begins to write poems that have this extraordinary formal integrity. It's because what Nordau was saying was that mystics are incapable of attention. They're incapable of proper cognition. Nordau said, for example, that the reason why the Impressionists painted the way they did was because their eyeballs were twitching. He wasn't able to understand that what modernist art was trying to do was to give artistic expression to the entire disintegration of the worldview of order and progress and evolution. That it was actually a conscious attempt to look behind the theories and fantasies of order at the principles of disorder and disintegration behind it. It was about the subjectivization of history rather than this objective process of progress. Nordau couldn't understand any of that. He was a literalist, and his book, Degeneration, which I've given you links to, was a kind of 600-page diagnosis of this problem. And he would have included Yeats in the diagnosis. So Yeats wants to ratify the theory of degeneration whilst increasingly being seen to be both mystical and yet somehow in charge. That he can manage mystical content, and he does so by articulating rigorous, vigorous form. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. And our next chat will be about a prayer for my daughter. But when you read that poem, I would ask you to notice the phrase, the ceremony of innocence is drowned from the second coming, and ask yourself the question, how might we link this to Yeats's discussion at the end of A Prayer for My Daughter about ceremony and innocence? How but in custom and in ceremony are innocence and beauty born? In other words, Irish Protestant sexual reproduction is a microcosm of the problems besetting the world more generally, and those are problems of eugenics, fitness, and increasingly mixed marriages and picking the wrong person to fecundate.